The stale scent of burnt coffee and decades-old bacon grease clung to the air in Granny's diner, a place that time seemed to have forgotten, much like many of its elderly patrons. Dust motes danced like tiny, forgotten spirits in the weak morning sunbeams that slanted through the large plate glass windows, illuminating the chipped formica tabletops and the patched cracks in the red vinyl of the booths. A faint, almost imperceptible hum emanated from the ancient, chrome-trimmed refrigerators lining the back wall, a low, steady testament to decades of tireless, uninterrupted service. For Arthur Wallace, this place was more than a diner, it was a sanctuary. It was the last bastion of a world that made sense, a world of simple routines and quiet dignity. At 78, routines were the scaffolding that held his days together. He sat in his usual booth, the one in the corner with a clear view of the door, a habit from a lifetime ago that he'd never managed to shake. The coffee in his mug was lukewarm, just the way he liked it. He'd already been here for an hour, reading the local paper, occasionally glancing up to nod at other regulars who shuffled in, their faces as familiar and worn as the checkered linoleum floor. This was his Sunday ritual, a quiet tradition he had upheld since his wife, Helen, had passed away 3 years ago. They used to come together, holding hands across this very table, her laughter the bright melody against the low hum of the refrigerators. Now, the hum was all that was left, a monotonous bass line to his solitude. He could almost see her sitting across from him, her eyes sparkling as she'd chide him for putting too much sugar in his coffee. The memory was so vivid it brought a dull ache to his chest, a familiar companion in his quiet life. He was just about to take another sip of his coffee when the peace was irrevocably shattered. The jingle of the bell above the door was harsh, aggressive, followed by the heavy thud of biker boots. 3 men swaggered in, their black leather vests seeming to suck the light out of the cheerful morning. The one in the lead, a man in his late 30s with a thick neck and a sneer that looked permanently etched onto his face, was Ryder. His cronies, Spike and Diesel, were hulking shadows that flanked him, their expressions a mixture of boredom and low-grade menace. Ryder's eyes swept the room with a look of profound disdain, as if the very existence of this quiet, unassuming place was a personal insult. He was a predator who had wandered into a petting zoo, and he was looking for something to break. His gaze landed on Arthur, who was slowly, carefully, trying to rise from his booth to get a refill. "Get out of my way, old man," Ryder snarled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate with pent-up aggression. He didn't wait for Arthur to move. His leather-clad arm, heavy and calloused from years of gripping handlebars and who knew what else, swung out with a sudden, brutal force that was both shocking and utterly unnecessary. A ceramic mug of lukewarm coffee spun through the air in a graceful, slow-motion arc before shattering on the floor, sending dark liquid splattering like an ugly, permanent stain. The slap that followed echoed through the diner, a sharp, sickening crack that cut through the mundane clatter of plates and hushed conversations, leaving a profound and unnatural silence in its wake. Arthur Wallace stumbled back a step, the impact a shocking explosion of light and sound behind his eyes. His knuckles turned bone-white as he gripped the worn edge of the table, his entire body straining to maintain its balance as his vision blurred, the diner tilting precariously around him like a ship caught in a violent squall. The ringing in his ears was so loud it momentarily drowned out the horrified gasps that rippled through the room. A collective, sharp intake of breath was the only sound for a long moment. Chloe, the young waitress with a perpetually worried expression who had just started working here last month, dropped her tray with a loud, terrified clatter, ceramic shards scattering like shattered dreams across the worn tile. The sound of breaking china was usually a common, almost comforting occurrence here, but this time it felt like a punctuation mark, a loud, violent declaration that something was profoundly and irrevocably wrong. Every eye in the room was now fixed on the scene, every breath held in a shared moment of apprehension. No one moved. No one dared to speak. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken fear and righteous indignation, a suffocating blanket of apprehension settling over the dusty room. Arthur, his face a mask of quiet, dignified shock and a deep, throbbing pain that radiated from his jaw, slowly steadied himself. A vivid red welt was already blossoming on his cheek, a stark, angry contrast to his pale, aged skin. His hands, gnarled with the arthritis of age and the distant memory of battles fought in the frozen mud of foreign lands, trembled ever so slightly, a tremor that only he could truly feel. He took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing down the hot, coppery taste of blood and the primal, long-dormant instinct to retaliate with a violence that would have shocked everyone in the room, most of all himself. But his gaze, when it met Ryder's, remained steady, unwavering, holding an ancient, unsettling intensity that seemed to defy both his years and the recent indignity he had suffered. He didn't utter a single word of protest or anger. With a quiet dignity that seemed to enrage the younger man even more, a dignity born of a lifetime of hardship and resilience, he reached for his worn baseball cap, which had been knocked to the floor. The brim bore a faded, almost invisible insignia of the 101st Airborne Division, a subtle hint of a past many had forgotten. He resettled it on his head with a precise, almost ritualistic motion, as if donning an invisible shield of honor. Then, with a sigh that was barely audible, a sound of profound weariness that spoke volumes more than any shout could, he sank back into the vinyl booth, a silent sentinel in a suddenly hushed and hostile room. His eyes, however, were now fixed on the diner's front door, a flicker of something unreadable, something ancient and patient, in their depths. Exactly 30 minutes earlier, as he did every Sunday, he had sent a text message from an old, battered flip phone to a single, encrypted number. It was a simple, weekly ritual. Same table. Coffee is ready. It was more than a message. It was a signal, a tradition, and today, unknowingly, a summons. Ryder smirked, a cruel, ugly twist of his lips, misinterpreting Arthur's silence as fear. He took a long, exaggerated sip from his own steaming mug, clearly relishing the terror he had instilled in the small room. He had just made the biggest, and what would prove to be the last, mistake of his life, and he wouldn't know it until the storm he had just summoned arrived at the diner's front door. Washed-up soldiers and fake heroes, Ryder muttered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, dripping with a venomous contempt. Always in the way. His two cronies, Spike and Diesel, burly men with matching leather vests emblazoned with a snarling wolf logo, chuckled nervously, their eyes darting around the room, gauging the reactions of the other patrons. They weren't as comfortable with the raw, unprovoked aggression as their leader was. Their bravado was more of a performance, a weak reflection of Ryder's own thuggery. A young couple, Megan and Chris, who had been trying to enjoy a quiet breakfast with their two small children, quickly and quietly ushered Lily and Sam towards the dimly lit exit, their faces etched with discomfort and concern, whispering reassurances to their terrified kids who couldn't understand what they had just witnessed. The air in the diner remained thick with unspoken tension, a suffocating blanket of apprehension. What Ryder, in his arrogant self-importance, didn't know, what no one in that dusty, time-worn diner could possibly have known, was the true identity of the man he had just so casually and brutally humiliated. His quiet, unassuming life in this small, forgotten town was a carefully constructed facade, a peaceful retirement earned through unimaginable sacrifice and valor. But more profoundly, Arthur wasn't alone. Oh no, not by a long shot. The son he had summoned wasn't merely a man. He was Commander Liam Wallace, a decorated officer in a branch of the military so discreet and so lethal that its very existence was a classified secret. And he absolutely never, ever traveled alone, especially not when meeting his father for their cherished Sunday coffee. The ancient diner clock ticked on, its steady, rhythmic rhythm a stark contrast to the rapidly escalating tension in the room. Ryder continued to laugh and posture, completely oblivious to the storm that was rapidly brewing on the horizon, a storm that was about to break with an undeniable, overwhelming force. Outside, a low rumble began, a sound that was at first mistaken for distant thunder, but which grew steadily, quickly, into a powerful, ground-shaking roar that vibrated through the diner's old, thin windows, rattling the cheap cutlery on the tables. Tires screeched on the pavement outside, not in protest or anger, but in a series of precise, disciplined stops, each one a punctuation mark in the escalating suspense. Patrons at the diner windows, their faces morphing from confusion to a dawning awe, and then to outright alarm, watched in stunned silence. 8 military transport vehicles, dark and imposing, pulled up with a synchronized, almost balletic precision that spoke volumes about the discipline and elite training of their occupants. These were not the usual army Humvees. They were sleek, heavily armored SUVs with tinted windows and subtle, almost invisible insignia that hinted at a unit that operated far outside the conventional military structure. Then came the boots. Heavy, combat-ready boots hitting the pavement with a rhythmic, intimidating thud, each step perfectly in sync with the others. 12 soldiers, clad in crisp, intimidating fatigues, filed into the diner with a silent, almost ethereal precision. But these were not standard-issue uniforms. They were a darker shade of gray, almost black, perfectly tailored, blending into the shadows. Their movements were fluid, their expressions unreadable, their eyes constantly scanning the room, assessing every person, every corner, every potential threat. The air in the room seemed to compress, weighted down by their sheer presence, by the quiet hum of their state-of-the-art tactical gear. At the very center of this disciplined, formidable formation strode a tall, imposing man in camouflage, his jaws set like granite, his eyes the color of flint, narrowed and scanning the room with an almost preternatural awareness. This was Commander Liam Wallace, Arthur's son. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to issue commands. The entire diner had already fallen into a stunned, absolute silence, every breath held, every eye glued to him, anticipating what was to come. His gaze fell first on the angry red mark that was blossoming on his father's cheek, and his eyes, hard as diamonds, narrowed into slits. Then he turned his cold stare to Ryder. His voice, when it finally came, was a low, dangerous growl, sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence, carrying an undeniable, absolute authority. "Who," he asked, his voice deceptively calm, "put their hands on this man?" Every eye in the diner, a silent jury, shifted to Ryder. But just as the soldiers began to take a coordinated step forward, Ryder did something no one, least of all Liam, expected. Instead of cowering in fear, he let out a short, ugly, barking laugh. A flicker of genuine recognition crossed his face, quickly followed by a smug, greasy grin that was even more unsettling than his earlier aggression. Well, Commander Wallace," he sneered, his voice filled with a new, shocking confidence that sent a fresh wave of confusion through the room. "Small world. You're a long way from Syria, aren't you?" The air crackled with a new, dangerous kind of tension. The patrons and even Liam's own elite soldiers looked on in stunned disbelief. How could this low-life biker possibly know the commander's name, let alone his classified operational history? Before anyone could process the new, terrifying mystery, Ryder moved with a surprising, desperate speed. He lunged for Chloe, the terrified waitress, yanking her back from behind the counter and pulling her in front of him like a human shield. A wicked-looking hunting knife, which he had produced from a sheath on his belt, was suddenly pressed against her throat. "Nobody moves," he roared, his eyes wild with a desperate, cornered animal fire. "Or the girl gets it. Your boys are tough, Commander, but are they faster than a blade? Now, let's all just calm down and talk like civilized people." The soldiers froze, their overwhelming power instantly neutralized by a single, desperate man with a knife. The situation had morphed in a heartbeat from a simple reckoning into a tense, unpredictable hostage standoff. The diner, which had just been a backdrop for petty bullying, had become a powder keg, and Ryder was holding the match. Liam held up a hand, a silent, clear signal to his men to stand down. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury, but his mind was a whirlwind of calculations, analyzing angles, assessing threats, processing the impossible new data point. This man knew who he was. "Let the girl go," Liam said, his voice even, betraying none of the turmoil inside. "This is between you and me." "Oh, I think she's part of it now," Ryder grinned, pressing the blade just a little closer to Chloe's skin, causing her to let out a small, choked sob. "See, you military types think you own the world, that you can just roll in and fix everything. But sometimes, the world bites back." The standoff was a deadlock. The soldiers couldn't risk a move that would endanger the hostage. Liam was constrained by protocol and the immediate, life-or-death threat to a civilian. It was then that Arthur, who had been watching the entire scene with a profound, unnerving calm, spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the thick tension like a surgeon's scalpel. "The tattoo on your wrist," Arthur said, his eyes fixed not on the knife, but directly on Ryder's. "The castle with the 3 towers. That's the insignia of the 3rd Engineer Battalion, am I right?" Ryder flinched, his eyes darting to Arthur for the first time with genuine, undisguised surprise. "What do you know about it, old man?" he snarled. "I know they were good men," Arthur said, his voice softening slightly, becoming almost paternal. "Tough as nails. I served with a few of them outside of Pusan during a particularly nasty winter. They wouldn't be proud of this, son. Hiding behind a terrified girl. That's not strength. It's fear. What happened to you? What happened to that soldier?" The words hit Ryder harder than any physical blow could have. The specific, unexpected mention of his old unit, a part of a life he had clearly tried to bury, and the quiet, probing disappointment in Arthur's tone, it seemed to bypass his hardened, aggressive exterior and strike something deep within. Something broken and long forgotten. His grip on Chloe loosened for a fraction of a second. His eyes, for a moment, lost their manic fire. It was the only opening Liam needed. In a blur of motion, Liam lunged forward, not at Ryder, but at the table next to him, sweeping a heavy tray of salt and pepper shakers onto the floor. The crash was a perfect, calculated distraction. In that split second, two of his soldiers moved with an almost supernatural speed, disarming a stunned rider and pulling a sobbing Chloe to safety in a single, fluid, perfectly executed motion. It was over. Just as local police, summoned by a silent alarm triggered by one of Liam's men, arrived to cuff a now sobbing, completely defeated rider, a sleek black sedan, unmarked but clearly official, pulled up outside. A man in a sharp, tailored suit, carrying a slim briefcase, stepped out. It was Mr. Sterling from the Pentagon. He entered the diner, his eyes immediately finding Liam and Arthur. "Commander," he said, nodding to Liam before turning to Arthur. "Mr. Wallace, we need to talk." He gestured towards the now cuffed rider. "That man is Ryder Heston, a disgraced ex-combat engineer. We've been tracking him for months. He's connected to a domestic extremist cell." The diner, which had just begun to breathe again, went silent once more. "They are planning to sabotage the old Northwood hydroelectric dam," Mr. Sterling continued, his voice grim and low. "And their plan involves using antiquated, non-digital demolition techniques. Methods from the Korean War era. Our modern analysts, our AI, they can't crack their strategy because they don't think that way anymore." He looked directly at Arthur, his gaze intense. "The assault on you was a random act of thuggery, sir. But it brought us directly to the one man in this state who can help us. The attack plans they're using, they are based on sabotage manuals that your old unit wrote the book on how to counter 60 years ago." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "We don't need you as a consultant to honor your past service, Mr. Wallace. We need your mind, right now, to stop a catastrophe. We need you to think like the men you fought against, and with, all those years ago." Arthur looked from Mr. Sterling to his son, then back at the stunned, grateful faces in the diner. He felt the weight of his 78 years, the quiet peace of his retirement, the comfort of his simple routines. And then he felt something else, something he hadn't felt in a very long time, the cold, clear, undeniable call of duty. The quiet Sunday morning coffee had become a matter of national security. His quiet life was over. But a new, vital purpose had just begun. He took one last sip of his coffee, the taste now sharp and full of a new meaning, and gave a slow, firm nod.